Hi guys and welcome to the channel. Recently I received an email asking me whether I wanted to try the new Tamron 150 to 500mm lens and a Sony A9 II camera. And since you guys have always been asking me to not only use my Canon gear but also try some other cameras, especially all the Sony equipment, I'm actually going to have some more Sony gear coming soon. I will start a little series of videos where I will compare the Sony cameras and lenses to my Canon equipment and just also share my thoughts in general about how I go in the field with the Sony cameras. So that's coming up soon. I hope you're as excited as me for that series of videos. And I must say right at the start, this lens has surprised me and also confused me at the same time. So let's see how I go on with this lens. The first time I took this lens out of the box, I was very impressed how it kind of felt really solid, nice build quality. The only thing I noticed that it's a very heavy lens. You can still handhold it easily, but compared to something really light like this Canon 100 to 500 RF for instance, this lens actually feels quite heavy, like well built, but also quite heavy on your hand. I'm not going to compare this lens directly to the 100 to 500 Canon, but because I use this 100 to 500 almost on a daily basis, I just use it as a point of reference. So the one thing I always struggle with Tamron lenses is that they zoom out the other way around compared to the Canon lenses. What I liked about this lens right off the bat is that when you zoom out, you can actually do this in one motion. I actually almost turned it the wrong way again. What I also really enjoyed about this lens is this cool lens foot with an integrated Arca Swiss kind of style. So you can directly slide it in most tripod heads. This is something that I think any lens should really have, and an awesome feature, because I was fumbling around trying to look for a lens plate until I looked at this foot again. I'm going like, oh, I can just slide this right into my tripod head, no problem. So this is something that I think is really awesome. And the range goes from f5 at 150mm to f6.7 at 500mm. So all in all, my first impression was very good of the lens. The only thing I really noticed that it was significantly heavier than like my 100 to 500 RF. The one thing I noticed with all the Tamron lenses that I've used in the past and recently the 150 to 600 G2 and this lens now is that the image stabilization for photography is good. This is probably the best image stabilization that I've used on any Tamron lens, but even the 150 to 600 for photos was fairly decent. Where it doesn't work as well for me when it comes to video. On my R5 and this 100 to 500mm RF lens, I can actually handhold video, and the IBIS in the camera combined with the IS in the lens allow me to get nice and stable footage whenever I need handheld video. With this lens, it is possible, and in fact, if I don't move much at all, if I just be completely stable and the bird is kind of staying in my viewfinder and I can just kind of freeze, the image stabilization actually I'd say is better than on the R5 and the 100 to 500. But the moment I move the camera or the bird moves and I have to move with the bird, it's not as nice anymore. It's quite jerky and still jumps up and down a little bit. And I tried all three different modes and there was some differences. Mode 2 and mode 3 sometimes work better, but overall it couldn't deliver the same beautiful stable video handheld that I was getting with my Canon combo. So most of you probably never run into this problem, but for me that would be a serious problem if I wanted to use the lens the way I'm using my 100 to 500. So it's just something to be aware of if you ever plan to do a lot of that kind of emergency handheld video. I had the chance to use this lens on the Sony A9 II in the field now for a little while, and I must say I've been very impressed. I get nice and sharp images and the autofocus works really nice and really fast and sticks to the bird. So all in all, I must say it actually positively surprised me. Let's talk about the thing that surprised me the most about this lens, and that's how well the autofocus worked in general. I was very happy with the results that I've been getting. The birds were tracked very well. For instance, the ducks on the pond, if the ducks were not moving much, every single frame was essentially in focus. And even the swimming ducks with different autofocus modes, I got really nice images and I got a large amount of usable images, and I never felt like I missed any scene because the lens didn't focus or was getting out of focus images. Of course, not every single photo was in focus and there was the odd miss here and there, but overall very good. And I tried different modes. I tried the automatic tracking on the A9 II, and I also tried the single or zone autofocusing methods, and in all methods the camera and lens performed very well, so very happy with that. Besides more stationary birds, I also had the opportunity to do birds in flight and some action photography of fighting birds with this Tamron and Sony combination, and again both delivered very well. The initial pickup of the birds was very fast, so if there was a bird flying in, I could instantly focus on it and the camera and the lens would stick with the bird, so that was very great. Against busier backgrounds, as expected, I get more out of focus images, but all in all, I was pretty happy with the results that I was getting of birds in flight and also the fighting birds. The one thing I missed, but that's not the lens's fault, but the camera's fault, is that it didn't have the eye tracking autofocus of my R5. And that's something that I've grown really fond of because it really helps me to get more action images in the field. So the lack of that made it a little bit more difficult, but the automatic tracking and the spot autofocus still performed very well and gave me a lot of nice and sharp images. I really think we should look at some image samples now, don't we? So let's jump right in. So here we have a beautiful Pacific black duck and early morning light with 150 to 500, A9 and ISO 1600. As you can see, when we zoom in to this image, we get some really nice sharpness and nice details. So all around an image I would be pretty happy with. What about you? Always let me know in the comments. So that's one really nice image. Let's move into the next one. A nice hard head. Not the nicest name for the duck, but what can you do? So that's a female hard head in some beautiful early morning light. If we zoom into that to 100%, we can see decent sharpness on the head, but we can see that actually most of the sharpness is on the body. And that was one of the problems I encountered with the A9 when I was using automatic tracking. That simply when you're tracking a bird like this duck, the automatic tracking will often jump onto the bird's body and ignore the head. And this is something that doesn't really happen on an R5 or an A1 with the animal eye autofocus. With those two cameras, the focus will stay on the bird's head, whereas on the A9 it often got confused and stuck to the bird's body. But all around, still a really nice image. And here's the male hard head, also in beautiful early morning light with the really nice chestnut colors. And if we zoom into that again, we can see really nice sharpness, nice details. The eye's a little bit too bright and the tail end there, but that would be really easy to fix when I edit this image. So all around, especially considering ISO 1600, a nice and clean file. And you will notice that I basically shoot at ISO 1600 throughout this whole video, more or less. It's almost my standard ISO because it's winter in Melbourne now, so the days are not too bright. And I'm a firm believer that you shouldn't be scared about high ISO. It's much more important to get a sharp image that's noisy than get a blurry image that has low ISO. With ISO, and I will show you in a future video, it's so easy to deal with now. So 1600, 3200, 6400 is really not a problem anymore, and you're losing great opportunities if you're shooting at too low ISO. Here's another image of a beautiful chestnut teal, a male duck, very nice, that iridescent green head, and this was shot at ISO 3200. So if we zoom into that, we see a little bit more noise, but all around really nice detail in this sort of low light situation. And then I have a couple more examples for you with some beautiful rainbow lorikeets from my backyard. And again, this shows the slight difficulty the A9 II had with this lens, but also when I tried it on other lenses. So again, because it doesn't have the animal eye autofocus, you have to hope that it either finds the head and focuses on the head, but most of the time it kind of focuses on the body. So a lot of times the most reliable focus that I found on the A9 II was the spot autofocus, just the traditional autofocusing method. But here we can have a look at the sample image with the automatic tracking. So the first image is a little bit soft because it kind of focused more towards the tail. The second image is a little bit sharper. And then in the third image, it actually found the head. So it's not really a problem, but compared to the animal eye tracking of an R5 on A1, it's definitely a little bit more difficult to work with. And if I was using this camera on a daily basis, my go-to autofocusing method would definitely be the spot autofocus, and I move the autofocus points around because it gives me the most control. The tracking just is a little bit ambiguous and I'm never really sure what it's going to pick. You may have also noticed that the gear on my table has changed. When I filmed this video initially, I didn't think I would be able to get the 200 and 600 and then A1 in time, but I did. More on that later, but there's a few examples that I managed to shoot the action in birds and flights. I really thought you'd be keen to see those. So here's the first image of these two Cape Barren geese just landing in this beautiful setting. When we zoom into that, focus is pretty decent, probably more on the body than the head, but overall an image I would be very happy with, nice and sharp at higher ISO. Next sequence, the camera still stayed nicely on the bird with the lens, and the second bird cannot actually be in focus simply because it's too far behind the other goose. And then this is a very interesting series of images where I show you the whole sequence of files now. They're not all sharp, but I think they show nicely the tracking ability of the camera and the lens. While it's not perfect, I thought overall this was quite impressive. So here we see the bird, first geese in focus, and then they just start chasing each other, and I'm just trying to stay on the bird with my focus and the lens tracking. And see, there's some images where it, for instance, kind of fell back to the rear goose because it was a little bit sort of slower with the focus, but it always managed to recover pretty well. And I mean, this is pretty dramatic action really. So when we look at this, we can see that the camera really nicely stayed on the bird, the lens stayed with the bird. And then unfortunately around here, it started to lose it and eventually regained it a little bit later, right around here. And then I cut the feet off, but got a couple more shots at the end. So while it wasn't perfect and nailed every single shot, I still thought it was an impressive example of the Tamron lens being able to track such fast action pretty well. And as expected, not all shots are sharp. When I was photographing the ducks, there was also two Australasian coots chasing each other. And I just ripped the camera around, tried to get some shots. I didn't prepare for this. These are just like action, and I tried to focus on it. So you can see here with the first shot, it focused on the rear bird. It's still kind of on the rear bird. Then it loses focus to the water. But as we're tracking along and I stay on that coot running in the front, it actually manages to regain focus and give me a nice action shot. And I thought this was an impressive example of the camera and the lens performing very well. It's not nailing every single shot like some other combinations might do, but it actually still always gives me some nice shots. So I think at that price point, that was pretty impressive to me. So then I had one really good opportunity. I had these two little corellas that were fighting and fighting and fighting for a long period of time. So I had the A92 Tamron 150 to 500, and I just fired away the whole time. And this time I mainly used the spot autofocus, just trying to keep it on one bird. Because with the tracking, it sometimes kind of jumped onto the grass background or was a little bit confused. So the spot autofocus here did a very good job. And let's look at some of the images. Here that cockatoo is basically trying to bite the other one in the tail, the other one saying, "No, leave me alone." So that's a really nice image. And here's one where they're just fighting. Nice action, and all these shots were really nice and sharp, as you can see. Like this whole series of images I found was very impressive with the spot autofocus, keeping it on the bird, firing away, Tamron 150 to 500, definitely sticking on the birds, no problem. And I had almost no out of focus images in this whole series. And the birds are jumping up and down, rolling around. So this was probably the most impressive series of images. And that was also in the nicest light, so that probably helped. Nice light, higher shutter speed, good action. And here I'll also show you now, I edited up a few of these files for you to see what I can do with the raw files and how we can create really nice images. We have good raw files and then take our photos to the next level by editing them up. And if you want to know how I edited those images and how you can make your own images look absolutely amazing, I highly recommend that you check out my masterclass down there in the description, where I take you step by step through the editing process and show you exactly how you can make your own images look absolutely amazing. So make sure to check that out. And I want to show you some other images now as well. In the beginning of this video, I said that I had the A9 II and the 150-500 and that I might get some other Sony Gear. You can see there's also a 200-600 and an A1 on the table now. We're all lucky, so I got this gear just in time for me to film this video and also to compare these two lenses in the field side by side, and I think that would be a very interesting comparison. So I took some images with the A9 II on the 200-600 and some images with the 150-500 on the A1, so we have really nice comparisons and can see how the two cameras stack up. And the first thing that I found interesting is that while the Tamron 150-500 worked pretty well on the A9 II, it actually seemed to work even better on the A1. And I would say the main reason is that the animal eye autofocus on the A1 is so good that it really helped the Tamron lens to achieve better focusing. So all in all, if we compare the images of the A1 with the 150-500 and then compared to the A1 and the 200-600, they're very, very similar in sharpness and details and everything. So I was very impressed with this. Whereas on the A9 II, the 200-600 seemed to work slightly better overall compared to the Tamron, where it just seemed to have a little bit more issues maintaining that critical focus at times. So I thought that was an interesting observation, where the A1 definitely helped the Tamron lens to achieve better results. But let's look at some of those images. So the first image I prepared for you here is with the A9 II and the 150-500, a beautiful Cape Barren goose. And if we zoom into that, we see some very nice detail, some very nice sharpness all around in this image. So an image I would be pretty happy with. So now let's look at the next image, which is the A9 II with the 200-600 at 600 millimeters. So if we zoom into that, we actually definitely see an increase in sharpness and details. And I can also put these images side by side for you. And if we zoom into 100%, that shows us that I think the 200-600 has an ever so slight edge in having a bit more fine detail, a bit more overall sharpness. But the difference isn't dramatic. What do you think? Let me know. And then I have another example for you, A9 with the 200-600 and then the A9 with the 150-500. So let's look at the 200-600 first. Nice and sharp, crisp details and a lot of nice fine details. So if we look at the second image, and this is the sharpest from the row of images that I took, we can see that there's a little bit less sort of fine detail and overall sharpness. So this was one of those occasions where the difference seemed to be bigger, but overall I didn't find the difference to be super huge in general. But now I've already told you that when I was using both of these lenses on the A1, my results actually changed a little bit, surprisingly. So I have a few images here for you of a beautiful silver gull in very early morning light. This is the A1 with the 200-600. Nice and sharp, nice details in the white feathers. And then now here we have the A1 with the Tamron 150-500. So if we look at these side by side, I think they both look very nice. They both have very good sharpness. And if I don't tell you what image is what, I don't think you would be able to guess, do you? Here's another example. A1 200-600 in the 1.6 crop mode. So the file size is now actually almost exactly the same as the A9 II. So if we zoom into that, we see some cracking detail, beautiful sharpness, even that little feather on the beak is sharp, all the little highlights, we see all the little strands of feathers in a beautiful sharp eye. So very good. And let's look at the 100-50 with a similar situation, similar Pacific black duck. Here we have the duck, and when we zoom into that, we also see some incredible sharpness, almost shocking sharpness. And this is what really surprised me. When I had the A1 with the Tamron, it did really, really, really good. So I don't know what it is, but I mainly attribute it to the animal eye autofocus and the slightly better overall autofocusing system of the A1 that really helped to get like the last 10% out of this lens that the A9 kind of seemed to lack a little bit more. Here I also had the hard head coming out of the water, raising its wings, and again the Tamron lens with the A1 gave me some really nice sharp keepers. I must say in this series, not every single shot was sharp. There was a few where the head became a little bit soft, but out of like 30 images, at least 20 to 25 were more than usable. I think that's a very acceptable result. So we can see nice and sharp when we zoom into here, nice details, and yeah, that Tamron lens performing very well. All in all, quite a fascinating comparison, isn't it? And which lens is the right one for you basically comes down to which do you prefer? A slightly smaller, cheaper, lighter lens with an external zoom that offers you a little bit more flexibility because it's a little bit wider on the shorter end, so you can maybe get away with only taking this lens with you, but also much shorter on the longer end because you can't use extenders and the lens only goes to 500 millimeters. So small package, very attractive price point with good image quality, good autofocus and so-so image stabilization? Or do you prefer the big gun, the big lens with the great internal zoom, great image quality, fast autofocus and really nice consistent results with nice fine detail and really good image stabilization and autofocus performance? And I think that really sums it up. Are you after something small and flexible or something that can give you the ultimate reach for those small distant birds? Personally, if I knew I was always photographing birds that are really far away and I really need this as my main lens and I want to maybe use an extender as well to get me to 840 millimeters, the Sony lens would be my choice. But if I think I'm more flexible, I like to take wider shots, I like to take shots at 500 millimeters, I just like to go for a walk and I value that this easily fits into any backpack with a lot of other gear around, then the Tamron lens is probably the lens for you. Overall, the performance was fairly similar. The Sony was slightly more consistent, but the Tamron really did a good job. So which one would you choose? Flexibility or ultimate reach? Let me know in the comments. Let's talk about what's not to like about the 150 to 500 millimeter lens. The main thing for me is I would have really liked to see it start at 100 millimeters instead of 150 millimeters. Because it's the same size essentially and weighs much more than the RF 100 to 500 millimeter lens, I feel like if it had started at 100 millimeters, it would have added so much flexibility to this lens. And it also would have helped to distinguish it more from the 200 to 600 millimeter lens. Because on my RF 100 to 500 millimeter lens, I really value the ability to zoom out all the way to 100 millimeters if I want like a more landscapey bird shot. On this lens, I could do it to a degree, but the difference between 100 and 150 millimeters is already quite large. So if this had started at 100 millimeters, it would have really nicely distinguished itself from the 200 to 600 millimeter because this would have been the lens for anyone who wants a really flexible lens and might only want to take one lens into the field with them. Now starting at 150 millimeters, you still have a little bit of that flexibility, but you would potentially still have to take a wider lens with you that you might not have to take with you if you had a lens starting at 100 millimeters. And then the other thing I want to mention again is that the VR is definitely not working as well compared to the Sony or the image stabilization in the Canon lens that I usually use. It works quite well if I'm completely stable, but the moment I move to the left or to the right or up and down, it just starts to get a little bit jerky. I could never get the same smoothness in the footage that I could get with the 200 to 600 or especially the RF 100 to 500. So that's the major drawbacks of the lens, but if you see it in the bigger picture, it's not actually bad. And overall, this lens has really positively surprised me. One more thing we should be talking about when comparing these two lenses is the minimum focusing distance. On the long end for the Tamron, it's 5.9 feet or 1.8 meters, and for the Sony it's 7.8 or 7.9 feet or 2.4 meters. So that's definitely an advantage for the Tamron lens that makes it a little bit more flexible because you can be much closer to your subject. Or if you're photographing tame birds, for instance, that come really close to your camera, with the Sony lens you have to be backing up a lot of times. So let's talk about the thing that confused me the most about this lens that's actually not directly related to this lens, but rather the Sony camera lineup in general. The Tamron 150 to 500 performed very well on the A9 II, and it performed even better on the A1. But both of these cameras are very high-end, very expensive cameras. The only camera I could really find that's matched it financially would be like an A7 III at $1,800, or if you want more megapixels, maybe an A7R III for $2,300. And then the only other two cameras you could possibly use, but they're already pushing $3,000 or more dollars, would be an A9, the original one, or an A7 R4, these Sony names. So for me, that was really the question that I asked myself when I was using this lens, because these two cameras did very well with it, but if you spend $1,300 on a lens, you're probably looking at the camera in a similar range to match this lens. So potentially you could use an APS-C camera as well. But other than that, only the A7 III seemed to really make sense to me. Is that your feeling as well? Please let me know in the comments which one of these cameras would you match up with this lens. Hope you guys enjoyed seeing me use some other gear than just my Canon stuff, like the 150 to 500, the A9 II, the A1, the 200 to 600. I'm not done making videos with them yet, so make sure to subscribe to my channel because I'll make some videos with the 200 to 600 A1, comparing it to my R5, 100 to 500. Might even compare the A9 II to the A1. I got a lot of interesting ideas coming up, so make sure to subscribe to my channel. Also, please let me know in the comments what do you think of this video. Are you gonna look at the 150 to 500 millimeter lens, or do you think the 200 to 600 is the go-to Sony lens in that range? And also let me know which camera would you match with the 150 to 500 so you're in a similar kind of price bracket. I really appreciate all your comments. Other than that, please make sure to check out my masterclass if you want to learn all about how to make your images look absolutely amazing. I know you will love it. Give me a thumbs up. Again, subscribe to my channel and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye.